Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, if you had been born into a dynasty where marriage to your own sibling was not a scandal but a sacred obligation embedded in the law, blessed by the priests, and enforced by the weight of 200 years of tradition, do you think you would have found a way to refuse? Or would you have done exactly what the system required and made sure you came out of it holding all the power anyway? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. There is a document, a papyrus fragment, cracked at its outer edges, preserved behind conservation glass in a museum collection in Berlin that bears what scholars believe to be Cleopatra's own handwriting. Not a decree, not a proclamation, not a letter composed for public consumption. One word, written in Greek in the margin of a tax exemption order, a single annotation scrawled beside an administrative authorization that someone else had drafted and brought to her for ratification. The word is genus toi, let it be done. That is all she wrote. And yet in those 3 syllables, in the particular pressure of reed on papyrus and the angle of the strokes as they have been analyzed by paleographers working from high-resolution photography, an entire architecture of authority is visible. Not the authority of a woman who had inherited a title and was performing its rituals. The authority of a woman who understood, with precise and unsentimental clarity, exactly what she was doing and had understood it from an early age, in a world that offered her no other way to survive. What follows is not a love story. It is not a romance built around the most famous woman of the ancient world and the powerful men who orbited her. Those stories exist, and they are not without their uses, but they have obscured something that the administrative record, the papyri, the coin series, the temple inscriptions, the excavation reports filed out of Alexandria and Thebes, and the dry plains of the Fayum reveals with a kind of cold and uncomfortable clarity. What the record reveals is a system so old, so deeply embedded in the institutional logic of a ruling dynasty, so thoroughly legitimized by theology and precedent and the accumulated weight of generations, that by the time Cleopatra VII was born into it, it had ceased to feel like a choice to anyone inside it. It simply was. It was the architecture of Ptolemaic power, and its most essential and most disturbing feature was the marriage of siblings, brothers to sisters, sisters to brothers, generation after generation, in a chain of deliberate, biological, and political consolidation that stretched back more than 200 years before Cleopatra drew her first breath. She did not design this system. She did not choose it. What she did, and what the record documents, with a precision that has no interest in sentimentality, was use it. She used it with a completeness and a coldness that distinguished her from every ruler who had come before her in the Ptolemaic line. She held the power in those marriages. She held it entirely. The question of who sat on the throne beside her is, in one sense, almost irrelevant. In another sense, it is the only question that matters. To understand what Cleopatra VII did and why she did it, it is necessary to go back to the origin point of the system she was born into, back to the late 4th century BC, to a battlefield in the eastern Mediterranean, to the death of a conqueror whose empire was too vast and too sudden to survive him intact. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in the year 323 BC, and the empire he had assembled across Macedonia, Greece, Persia, Egypt, and the edges of the Indian subcontinent dissolved almost immediately into a series of wars among his surviving generals, each of whom was attempting to claim as large a portion of the wreckage as he could hold. These wars lasted decades. They were brutal and complex, and they produced, eventually, a set of successor kingdoms, the Hellenistic kingdoms. Historians would later call them each governed by a Macedonian Greek ruling class, transplanted into a population and a culture that was not its own. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, the son of Lagus, who had been one of Alexander's most trusted commanders and who had, from the very beginning of the succession crisis, maneuvered with exceptional intelligence to secure Egypt as his particular prize. He understood that Egypt was different from the other successor territories. It was an enclosed geographic unit, protected by desert on 3 sides and the Mediterranean on the fourth. It had the Nile, which meant it had agriculture on a scale no other territory in the ancient world could match. It had Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded at the mouth of the Nile Delta, which was rapidly becoming the most important commercial and intellectual center in the Mediterranean world. And it had something else, something that Ptolemy recognized and that his successors would spend 3 centuries exploiting. It had an ancient, extraordinarily deep, and extraordinarily durable religious and cultural identity that the population had no intention of abandoning just because a Macedonian general had declared himself its ruler. Ptolemy I Soter, Ptolemy the Savior, as he would eventually be called, declared himself Pharaoh of Egypt in 305 BC. He was not Egyptian, he spoke Greek. His court spoke Greek. His administration conducted its business in Greek. His legal codes derive from Macedonian precedent. And yet, from the very beginning, the Ptolemaic rulers understood that to govern Egypt effectively, to extract its grain surplus and its temple revenues and its trading profits without constant armed resistance from a population of several million people who had their own traditions, their own priesthood, their own theology, and their own very clear idea of what a legitimate ruler looked like, they had to perform Egypt. They had to appear in the temples. They had to adopt the titles. They had to make offerings to the gods in the correct form, following the correct ritual sequence, dressed in the correct garments. They had to look like pharaohs, because looking like pharaohs was what the population required of them in exchange for cooperation. And embedded in the deepest theology of what it meant to be a pharaoh in the foundation stories, in the creation myths, in the divine genealogy that gave the institution of kingship, its legitimacy was the union of a brother and a sister, Osiris and Isis, the god who died and was restored, and the goddess who found him, reassembled him, and bore his son. The divine template upon which the entire symbolic structure of Egyptian kingship rested was a marriage of siblings, not a scandal, a sacrament. The Ptolemies did not invent sibling marriage. They inherited a theological justification for it that was already more than 1,000 years old. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the epithet itself, translates as brother-loving, and it was not chosen, casually formalized sibling marriage as Ptolemaic dynastic practice when he married his full sister Arsinoe II, sometime around 278 BC. The marriage was controversial in Greek intellectual circles, where it was mocked as a barbaric concession to Egyptian custom. The mockery did not matter. What mattered was that the Egyptian priestly establishment understood exactly what was happening and responded accordingly with legitimacy, with incorporation of the royal pair into temple ritual, with the theological recognition that made Ptolemaic rule sustainable in a country where the priesthood controlled the agricultural calendar, the irrigation systems, and the symbolic vocabulary through which power communicated itself to the population. From that point forward, the pattern was set. Brother married sister, sister ruled alongside brother. The bloodline stayed within the family. The titles stayed within the family. The treasury, the accumulated wealth of the most productive agricultural territory in the ancient world, stayed within the family. Across the next 2.5 centuries, the dynasty repeated this pattern so consistently, and the gene pool narrowed so progressively, that modern analysis of the skeletal record and the artistic representations of late Ptolemaic rulers has suggested, though not conclusively demonstrated, that the physiological consequences of sustained inbreeding were beginning to manifest in the royal line by the final generations, and yet the marriages continued, because the marriages were not, at their core, about biology. They were about power. They were about a system that had worked, more or less, for 200 years, and that no one inside the system had the leverage or the inclination to dismantle. Cleopatra VII was born into this system in 69 BC. Her father was Ptolemy XII Auletes the flute player, a nickname that subsequent history has not been kind about, suggesting a ruler more interested in music and court performance than in the hard work of governing a kingdom that was, by the middle of the 1st century BC, in an increasingly precarious position relative to the expanding power of Rome. Ptolemy XII was not a strong ruler by the standards that history applies to strong rulers. He was, however, a survivor, and survival in the late Ptolemaic world required a particular kind of intelligence. Not military intelligence, not administrative intelligence, but political intelligence of the most transactional kind. He understood that the Ptolemaic dynasty could not survive the 1st century BC without Roman recognition and Roman support, and he was willing to pay whatever price that recognition required. He spent enormous sums bribing Roman senators to formalize his legitimacy. He borrowed money from Roman financial interests at rates that were ruinous for the Egyptian treasury. He accepted the annexation of Cyprus, a Ptolemaic territory, governed by his brother by Rome without military resistance, an act of capitulation so damaging to his standing in Alexandria that his own court expelled him from Egypt in approximately 58 BC. He spent 3 years in Rome, lobbying and paying, and eventually returned to Egypt in 55 BC with Roman military support behind him. When he returned, he dealt with those who had opposed him in the way that the Ptolemaic tradition dealt with internal opposition. His daughter, Berenice IV, who had ruled in his absence and who was, by that point, his rival for the throne, was executed. Cleopatra was a child when her father was expelled, approximately 11 years old. She was approximately 17 when he came back over the bodies of his opponents. The lesson was written in very plain language, and she read it. Ptolemy XII died in 51 BC. He left behind a will, a document whose terms were witnessed by Roman authorities and recorded in Roman administrative archives that specified joint succession to 2 of his children, Cleopatra VII, who was at this point approximately 18 years old, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was approximately 10. The will carried, embedded in its structure, the expectation of marriage between these 2 co-regents. This was not unusual. It was the system operating as designed. The marriage was formalized as part of the succession process. Official documents were issued in both names, coins were minted bearing both faces. In the administrative papyri recovered from provincial archives in the Fayum region, dry, preserved, stacked in the back rooms of temple complexes, where the climate had kept them intact for more than 2,000 years. The regnal dating formulas of this period carry both names, Cleopatra and Ptolemy, as required by convention and by law. The official record said joint rulers. The official record was, in a very specific and very important sense, performing a fiction, because Ptolemy XIII was 10 years old, and Cleopatra VII was 18 and spoke 7 languages and had spent her adolescence in one of the most politically complex courts in the ancient world, watching her father navigate the knife edge between Ptolemaic survival and Roman absorption. She had been educated. The sources are consistent on this, even the Roman sources that were not inclined toward flattery, with an exceptional thoroughness. She had learned Greek and Egyptian, which no Ptolemaic ruler before her had bothered to do, and which gave her direct access to the population she governed in a way that her predecessors, working always through interpreters, had never possessed. She had learned Latin, Aramaic, Ethiopian, and several other languages of the Eastern Mediterranean commercial world. She had studied mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and administration. She was, by the time she ascended to the co-regency, almost certainly the most intellectually prepared ruler the Ptolemaic dynasty had produced in at least 2 generations. Her co-regent was a 10-year-old boy. The question of who held power in truth within this arrangement is not a difficult question. It is a question that the official record declines to answer directly, because the official record was not designed to answer it. The official record was designed to maintain the appearance of the system. and the appearance of the system required two names on every document. What happened behind that appearance is what the record can only gesture at through what it does not say. What it does not say is that Ptolemy XIII governed. What it does not say is that any administrative decision of consequence in the first years of the co-regency was made by a child. What the record does contain fragmentarily, in the surviving papyri, in the temple records, in the reports of provincial administrators, is consistent evidence of active, engaged, detail-oriented governance that does not suggest consultation with a 10-year-old. Tax policy decisions, agricultural allocation orders, temple restoration authorizations, diplomatic communications with neighboring kingdoms and with Roman authorities. The administrative apparatus of Egypt, which was vast and ancient and required constant attention, was functioning, and the person attending to it was not the junior co-regent. The court faction that surrounded Ptolemy XIII understood this perfectly well. Pothinus, the eunuch who served as chief minister and who held the authority that came with managing a child king's affairs, and Achillas, the military commander who controlled the army, and a handful of other court officials, these men saw what was happening. And what was happening was that Cleopatra was exercising sole authority over a co-regency that was legally required to be shared. By approximately 48 BC, roughly 3 years into the reign, they moved against her. The mechanism of her removal from Alexandria is not clearly documented in any surviving source. She was forced out by threat or by decree or by the credible presence of armed men. The sources do not say precisely. And she retreated to the eastern frontier of Egypt, to the garrison region near Pelusium at the edge of the Nile Delta, where the cultivated land ended and the desert of Sinai began, and there, in the heat and the dust of that desolate frontier, she raised an army. She did not retreat. She repositioned. There is a difference, and she understood it. What she also understood, and this is where the cold, strategic intelligence the record attributes to her becomes most clearly visible, was that the civil war she was preparing to fight would not be decided by Egyptian troops alone. Egypt in 48 BC was not an independent political actor in any meaningful sense. It was a wealthy client state existing in the shadow of Roman power, and Roman power in 48 BC was in a state of violent, convulsive internal conflict. Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus were in the final stages of a civil war that had been consuming the Roman world for years, a conflict that would determine who controlled not just Rome, but the entire network of territories and relationships that Rome had built across the Mediterranean. And that conflict was about to arrive on Egyptian soil, carried by the man who had lost. Pompey, defeated at the Battle of Pharsalus in northern Greece in 48 BC, fled eastward toward Egypt, toward a kingdom whose late king had owed him political debts, toward a court he presumably expected to offer him asylum and support. What the court of Ptolemy XIII offered him instead was a small rowing boat, a short journey across shallow coastal water near the city of Pelusium, and 3 men waiting for him on the shore with weapons. Pothinus and Achillas made the calculation that Pompey was finished, that Caesar was the future, and that presenting Caesar with a dead rival would purchase Roman goodwill for their faction of the Egyptian civil war. They were wrong about the goodwill. Caesar arrived in Alexandria days after Pompey's murder, was shown the severed head, and according to the ancient sources, wept. Not necessarily from grief alone, from the recognition, more likely, that a useful political opportunity had been taken from him. He had intended to pardon Pompey publicly. He had intended to demonstrate mercy. That demonstration was now impossible. Caesar was angry, and Caesar was in Alexandria, and Cleopatra was at the frontier with an army. She saw the opening with the precision that characterized everything she did, and she moved. The story of how she entered the palace, the rolled carpet, or the linen sack, or some other method of concealment, past the guards of a city that her brother's court controlled, appears in Plutarch's Life of Caesar, written more than a century after the events it describes. Its literal accuracy cannot be confirmed. What can be confirmed through multiple ancient sources that corroborate each other on the essential point is that she got in, and that the meeting between Cleopatra VII and Julius Caesar produced, almost immediately, one of the most consequential political alliances in ancient history. Caesar had arrived in Alexandria with a relatively small force and had almost immediately found himself effectively besieged in the palace complex by Ptolemaic troops loyal to Ptolemy XIII's court faction. He was technically there to adjudicate a succession dispute, to enforce the terms of the late Ptolemy XII's Roman witnessed will, which had specified joint rule. Cleopatra's appearance gave him a local partner, a legitimate claimant whose case he could support without appearing to be simply seizing Egyptian territory for Rome. The argument was thin. But Caesar had legions, and thin arguments backed by legions have a long history of succeeding in the ancient world. She was not what he had expected. She was not a frightened exile seeking protection. She was a ruler making a calculated offer of alliance to the most powerful man in the world, and she made it with a directness and a confidence that the sources record without knowing quite what to do with the Alexandrine War, the months-long conflict that consumed the winter of 48 to 47 BC in the streets of Alexandria and across its harbor was prolonged and frequently inconclusive. There was street fighting across the city's grid of wide avenues. There was naval combat in the eastern harbor, among the islands and the lighthouse approaches. There was a famous episode in which Caesar, pressed by enemy forces near the waterfront, was forced to swim from a burning ship to safety, a story that appears in multiple ancient sources and that modern historians generally accept as substantially accurate, noting that Caesar was in his mid-50s at the time. There was, during this period, a fire near the Alexandrian docks that may or may not have damaged the Great Library, a question that scholars have debated for centuries, with the weight of evidence suggesting that warehouse storage near the waterfront was burned while the library's main collection survived. The stalemate broke only when Roman reinforcements arrived overland from the east in the spring of 47 BC, and then there was Ptolemy XIII, dead in the Nile. He was approximately 13 years old. His golden armor was the identifying feature when his body was recovered from the water, according to Suetonius. He had been a child, used as a standard by a court faction that was more interested in its own survival than in his, and when the military situation collapsed, he died in it. The ancient sources do not resolve whether he drowned fleeing a lost battle or whether his death was more deliberate. Cleopatra, who had every operational reason to want him gone, and who had just aligned herself with the man who had the most military power in the immediate situation, is not directly implicated in any surviving ancient text. The absence of direct implication in a world where record-keeping was controlled by the victors is not the same as innocence. But the record offers only the absence, and the silence of absences in the ancient world is one of the most common forms of concealment. After Ptolemy XIII's death, Cleopatra did what the tradition required. The dynasty demanded a male co-regent alongside the queen. She had one remaining younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was approximately 11 or 12 years old at the time. She married him. The ceremony was performed, the documents were issued. Both names appeared in the regnal formulas. The coins were minted, the temples received their joint dedications, the system was satisfied. And the question of who held power in this second co-regency requires even less consideration than the first, because Cleopatra was now approximately 22 years old, had survived a civil war, an Alexandrian siege, and the removal of one co-regent had demonstrated across 3 years of extraordinary political and military pressure and administrative intelligence that had no parallel in the late Ptolemaic line, and had secured the personal and military support of the most powerful man in the Roman world. Ptolemy XIV was a child assigned a title. Cleopatra VII was a ruler who had already proven, at considerable cost, that she intended to govern. The title and the governance were not the same thing, and the papyrus record of this second co-regency makes no serious attempt to pretend otherwise. His name appears where the formula requires a name. Her administrative fingerprint is on everything the formula does not require. Caesar remained in Egypt for several months after the end of the Alexandrine War. He and Cleopatra traveled together up the Nile, a journey documented in Appian and referenced in several other ancient sources, on a royal barge accompanied by a fleet of several hundred ships. The journey was not tourism, and it was not intended to be seen as tourism. It was a display, a theatrical declaration to the Egyptian population and to the priests of the Nile Valley temples that their queen was under the protection of the most powerful military commander in the known world. Cleopatra understood the grammar of political spectacle as thoroughly as she understood administrative detail. She knew that what people saw shaped what they believed, and that what they believed shaped how much resistance they offered. The journey up the Nile was a statement in a language every Egyptian temple priest, and every provincial administrator, and every farmer watching from the bank understood perfectly. This woman's authority is not in question, and this Roman general is not her conqueror, but her ally. In the spring of 47 BC, she gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar. He was known almost immediately by the popular name Caesarian Little Caesar. The political architecture of that name, in that world, was not subtle and was not meant to be. She was announcing a connection between her dynasty and the most powerful name in Rome in the most direct way available to her. Caesar returned to Rome and its wars in the spring of 47 BC. In 46 BC, Cleopatra followed him, bringing the infant Caesarion and the nominal co-regent Ptolemy XIV and the full apparatus of a royal visit to Rome. She stayed for nearly 2 years. Her presence in the city was a source of fascination and discomfort in roughly equal measure for Roman aristocratic society, which could not decide whether to be impressed by her or appalled by the influence she appeared to exercise over Caesar. The hostile voices, and there were many, described her as a foreign queen, as a corrupting influence, as a dangerous Eastern presence in a political world that was already under enough internal strain without a Ptolemaic queen conducting business across the Tiber. The record of how Cleopatra herself experienced these 2 years in Rome is essentially non-existent. No letters survive, no diaries, no accounts from anyone in her immediate circle that have come down intact. What the record shows is that she was there, that she conducted herself publicly with complete composure, and that she left when circumstances required it. Julius Caesar was assassinated on the 15th of March, 44 BC, stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Theater of Pompeii by senators who believed they were saving the Republic. What they actually destroyed was the Republic. The civil wars that followed Caesar's death would consume it completely, but in the immediate moment, they removed the central pillar of Cleopatra's Roman architecture. She returned to Egypt, and then Ptolemy XIV died. The timing falls within the same year, 44 BC, though the precise month is not clearly established in any surviving source. He was approximately 18 or 19 years old. The cause of his death is not recorded anywhere in the contemporary documentary record. No surviving papyrus from the Egyptian administrative archives notes his illness, his decline, or the manner of his passing. No temple record marks a period of mourning for a co-regent of that age. The death simply appears as a fact in the gap between his last mention in a dated administrative document and the first document that records him as no longer ruling. What follows his disappearance from the record is this. Cleopatra elevated Caesarion Ptolemy XV Caesar, her son by Julius Caesar, who was at this point approximately 3 years old, to the position of co-regent. The child was designated with an elaborate string of epithets. He was an infant. His mother was 30 years old, in the full operational capacity of her administrative capabilities, and for the first time in her reign, the co-regent sitting beside her in the official record was not a brother whose continued existence represented a potential rival for sole authority. He was her son. A son, particularly a very young son, is not a threat to a mother's power. A brother, growing older every year in a dynasty that had a long history of siblings deposing siblings, is something else entirely. The ancient writer Josephus, working several centuries after the fact, states that Ptolemy XIV was poisoned by Cleopatra. Modern historians approach this claim with appropriate caution. Josephus was not a contemporary. His source for this specific claim is unclear, and his account of the Ptolemaic court is not always reliable in its particulars. What modern historians cannot do is disprove the claim, because the contemporary documentary record offers nothing. There is no cause of death, there is no investigation, there is no archival record of any formal process surrounding the death of a co-regent of Egypt. There is the death, and there is what came after it, and what came after it was convenient, measurably, documentably convenient for the sole remaining adult ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The record does not convict, but the record does not exonerate. It simply, and very deliberately, says nothing. The years between 44 BC and 41 BC are the period of Cleopatra's reign that the Romantic biographical tradition tends to pass over most quickly in its hurry to get to Mark Antony and the drama of Actium. They are, in terms of the administrative record, some of the richest years of her documented governance: tax reform documents, agricultural land allocation orders, responses to petitions from provincial administrators, temple restoration authorizations, diplomatic correspondence with Nabatean Arabia, with Cyprus, with Cyrenaica, with the various Roman authorities whose relationships with Egypt had to be maintained and negotiated as the Roman world went through its own convulsions following Caesar's death. These years show a ruler governing with hands-on, detailed engagement across multiple administrative domains simultaneously. They show a ruler who understood that the foundation of political power was not the favor of any particular Roman commander, however powerful, but the operational health of the state she governed, its grain surplus, its tax revenue, its administrative stability, its standing with the priestly establishment that gave Egyptian kingship, its theological legitimacy. She was governing Egypt. She was governing it alone. And she was governing it well. By every standard that the administrative record makes available for evaluation, Mark Antony summoned her to Tarsus in 41 BC. The summons was issued as a command. Antony, as the senior Roman authority in the eastern Mediterranean, following the defeat of Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, had the authority to summon client rulers, and he used it. The ostensible reason was an accusation that Cleopatra had supported the wrong faction in the recent civil war. He expected, presumably, a chastened queen arriving to answer charges and demonstrate submission to Roman authority. What he received has been recorded by Plutarch in one of the most vivid passages in ancient biographical writing, drawn from the earlier account of Dellius, who was actually present at Tarsus. A gilded barge with purple sails and silver oars moving to the sound of flute music. Cleopatra reclining beneath a golden canopy in the costume of Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids and sea nymphs. The population of Tarsus, the entire city, according to Plutarch, left the docks to crowd around the river and watch, and Antony was left sitting alone in his official tribunal in the marketplace, with no audience and no authority, because everyone had gone to see her arrive. The message was designed with the same care and intelligence that went into everything Cleopatra did, and it was perfectly legible. She was not a client queen appearing before her Roman overlord. She was a goddess condescending to receive a visitor. He was not summoning her. He was being granted an audience. The political alliance that followed, personal as well as strategic, extending across more than a decade and producing 3 children, was, at its core, a transaction between 2 powers that each needed what the other had. Antony needed Egyptian grain to feed his armies, Egyptian gold to pay them, Egyptian naval capacity to project military power in the eastern Mediterranean, and Egyptian administrative stability as a logistical base for his campaigns against Parthia in the east. Cleopatra needed Roman military force, Roman legitimacy, and Roman protection for the Ptolemaic dynasty's continued existence in a world that Rome was swallowing one territory at a time. She had watched her father spend his reign appeasing Rome. She had watched the annexation of Cyprus. She had watched the Roman military apparatus install and remove Ptolemaic rulers as its political needs dictated. She understood, with perfect clarity, that the Ptolemaic dynasty's survival in the 1st century BC was not a question of Egyptian military strength. Egypt had no military strength sufficient to resist Rome, but a question of whose side you were on inside Rome's civil conflicts, and how useful you could make yourself to the winning faction. The alliance with Antony was a calculated bet on the right man. It was not the only calculation she made, but it was the largest one, and it was ultimately the one that killed her. Antony made territorial grants to Cleopatra, formal transfers of Roman client territories to Ptolemaic control, including Cyprus, parts of the Levantine coast, and portions of other eastern Mediterranean regions that were politically devastating to his standing in Rome. His enemies, led most effectively by Octavian, Caesar's adoptive heir and Antony's rival for supremacy in the Roman world, weaponized these grants with relentless skill. Roman political culture was already primed to view Cleopatra with hostility to a foreign queen, an Eastern woman, a practitioner of exotic and corrupting religions, a seductress who had already ensnared Caesar and was now doing the same to Antony. The propaganda machinery of Octavian's faction refined this hostility into a formal political argument. Antony had been unmanned by an Eastern queen, had surrendered Roman territory to her, was planning to make Alexandria the capital of the Roman world and install a foreign woman on its throne. The argument was effective precisely because it was only partly false. Antony had made the grants. He was deeply committed to Cleopatra and to the political alliance she represented. What the argument accomplished, regardless of its full accuracy, was to frame the war between Octavian and Antony not as a Roman civil war between two Roman factions, which is what it was, but as a Roman war against a foreign Eastern threat. It was a reframing of profound political genius, and it worked. The Battle of Actium was fought on the 2nd of September, 31 BC, in the waters off the western coast of Greece. It was a naval engagement between the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra on one side and Octavian's fleet under his admiral Agrippa on the other. The ancient sources hostile to Cleopatra, primarily Plutarch and Cassius Dio, both writing well after the event and drawing on sources filtered through the political perspective of the Augustan period that followed, describe her departure from the battle as flight, as panic, as the irrational abandonment of a fight that was still winnable, with Antony catastrophically following her instead of continuing to engage. Whether the departure was panic or a tactical decision made in response to battle conditions that are no longer recoverable from the surviving record, or a pre-planned withdrawal that went wrong, or something else entirely, this is a question the surviving evidence cannot answer. What it can answer is what came afterward. What came afterward was the end. Antony's forces, deprived of their commander's presence and exposed to defection pressure from Octavian, dissolved in the weeks and months following Actium. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. Octavian advanced on Egypt from multiple directions. Antony's remaining troops chose surrender over loyalty. The ancient accounts describe what happened in Alexandria in the months between Actium and the final Roman advance in the summer of 30 BC in ways that are revealing about both figures. Antony withdrew, became isolated, paranoid, convinced that Cleopatra was negotiating a separate peace with Octavian behind his back. Cleopatra, according to the same sources, was negotiating with Octavian through intermediaries, through letters, through the sophisticated diplomatic channels she had spent her career maintaining. Whether her negotiations were a betrayal of Antony or a rational attempt to secure whatever terms she could for herself and her children in a situation that had become militarily hopeless is a question that depends entirely on which ancient source you read and how much trust you extend to sources that were all in one way or another produced by or for the regime that replaced her. There is something worth pausing on in the reconstruction of what those final months in Alexandria looked like from the inside, from inside the palace, inside the administrative machinery that was still running because someone was still running it. The ancient sources describe Antony's deterioration with a kind of sympathetic attention that the same sources rarely extend to Cleopatra. Because Antony was Roman, and his suffering fit the narrative categories Roman biography had available for noble decline, he withdrew. He sat in isolation. He renamed himself according to Plutarch, abandoning the grandiose title he had cultivated comparing himself to Dionysus, the god of wine and transformation, and calling himself instead Timonides, after Timon of Athens, the famous misanthrope who had retreated from the world out of contempt for its ingratitude. It is a strikingly literary gesture for a man facing military annihilation, and the sources record it with the attention they give to gestures that reveal character. What the same sources give far less attention to is what Cleopatra was doing during those same months. She was, the sources acknowledge almost in passing, conducting negotiations. She was making arrangements. She was moving gold and treasure and other portable wealth into a mausoleum she had already constructed, possibly as insurance, possibly as preparation for an end she saw coming more clearly than anyone around her wanted to acknowledge. She was, in the final months of everything she had built and defended and fought for across 39 years, still functioning as a head of state, still making the calculations that heads of state make, still attempting to find a path through a situation that had no good paths left. The contrast between Antony naming himself after a misanthrope and retreating into philosophical despair, and Cleopatra moving assets and conducting diplomatic correspondence and preparing contingencies, is not a contrast that reflects particularly well on either the ancient sources or the modern biographical tradition that inherited their frameworks. She was, to the end, working, and the work to the end was recognizably the same work she had always been doing, the work of keeping a dynasty alive in a world that had been trying to end it for a very long time. Antony died on the 12th of August, 30 BC. He had received false information that Cleopatra was already dead and attempted to kill himself with his own sword. The attempt was botched. He survived long enough to be carried to wherever Cleopatra had barricaded herself, and he died there. Cleopatra died on the same date. She was 39 years old. The method of her death has been debated since antiquity and is still not resolved. The canonical version, the ASP, the Egyptian cobra, applied deliberately to produce a death that looked peaceful enough to be found by Octavian's soldiers without signs of violence, appears in Plutarch and became the image that 2,000 years of artists and dramatists fixed as the defining moment of her life. The medical difficulties with this version are real. An Egyptian cobra's venom produces a death that is not quick, not painless, and not compatible with the composed and ceremonially arranged scene that the ancient sources describe. Modern scholarship has proposed poison, hemlock, opium, a compound prepared by her own physicians, as more consistent with the physiological evidence, such as it is. Others have noted that the snake story may have been a deliberate construction, perhaps Cleopatra's own, staged to deny Octavian the spectacle of her execution. She knew what happened to defeated rulers in Roman triumphs. She had seen it happen to her sister, Arsinoe IV, who was dragged in chains through the streets of Rome as part of Caesar's triumph in 46 BC alive, displayed like a trophy, to the point that the Roman crowd apparently wept for her. Cleopatra was not going to be wept for in the streets of Rome. Whatever the method, the decision, if it was her decision, and not an execution arranged to look like suicide, was itself an act of the same cold and absolute control that had characterized everything she did. The last thing she controlled was the manner in which she ceased to exist. Caesarion Ptolemy XV, Caesar, her son, 17 years old, was captured by Octavian's forces shortly afterward. He was executed. The reasoning attributed to Octavian by the ancient sources is a line that has survived 2,000 years because of its precision. One Caesar was enough. The boy who had been named for his father, elevated to co-regent before he could walk, and who had spent his entire short life as the living symbol of his mother's most consequential alliance, was killed because his continued existence was a political inconvenience. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended with him, in the most literal possible sense. The 3 children Cleopatra had borne to Antony Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were spared, carried to Rome, and displayed in Octavian's triumph, walking in chains through the streets of the city in the place their mother had refused to occupy. Cleopatra Selene eventually married Juba II, the king of Mauritania, and the line continued through her. Her brothers disappear from the historical record within a few years. Egypt became a Roman province, administered by a prefect appointed by Octavian, who would soon adopt the title Augustus and subject to a level of direct personal oversight that Augustus maintained for the rest of his life. He forbade Roman senators and military commanders from visiting Egypt without his personal authorization. The reason given was Egypt's strategic importance as a grain supplier. The real reason, which the administrative arrangement makes clear, was that Egypt was too valuable and too symbolically loaded to be trusted to anyone who might be tempted by it. Augustus understood what Cleopatra had, understood what the Ptolemies had always understood about what Egypt was and what it meant. He had just spent years at war with the last person who had understood it as well as he did. It is worth considering, for a moment, what the Egyptian population experienced across the 39 years of Cleopatra's life and the 21 years of her active reign. The administrative papyri that survived from her period, the tax receipts, the land allocation records, the petitions filed by farmers and merchants and temple administrators to the provincial offices of the Ptolemaic state tell a story that is almost entirely separate from the one that Greek and Roman literary sources preserve. They tell a story of a state that functioned, irrigation systems maintained, temple festivals funded, grain distribution records kept with the kind of meticulous attention that only happens when there is a governing authority that understands the connection between administrative competence and political survival. Egypt under Cleopatra VII was not a paradise. The Ptolemaic system of agricultural taxation was extractive by any reasonable standard, and the gap between the wealth of the court and the conditions of the farming population in the delta and the valley was enormous. But it was a state with a functioning administrative spine, and the evidence suggests that spine was maintained with more consistency during her reign than it would be in the first decades of Roman provincial administration that followed. The Roman prefects who succeeded her were not incompetent men, but they were administrators of a foreign province working within a system they had not built and did not entirely understand, reporting to a capital more than 2,000 kilometers away, across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra had been governing Egypt from inside it, in its own language, with the legitimacy that came from a dynasty that had ruled the country for nearly 3 centuries. The transition from her administration to theirs was not seamless. The papyri from the early Roman period in Egypt document disruptions, tax collection failures, irrigation maintenance lapses, disputes between temple establishments and new Roman administrative authorities that do not appear with the same frequency in the Ptolemaic administrative record of her reign. She had held something together. When she was gone, the holding together required renegotiation from the ground up. The tradition that Cleopatra embodied and perpetuated the sibling marriages, the dynastic consolidation, the theological legitimacy borrowed from a pharaonic theology 2,000 years older than the Ptolemaic house itself, did not die with the dynasty. Papyri recovered from the Fayum region and from other parts of Roman Egypt document sibling marriages among ordinary Egyptian families, not royal families, at rates that surprised and in some cases shocked the European scholars who first cataloged these documents in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The practice had filtered down from the royal court into general social practice over the course of nearly 3 centuries of Ptolemaic rule. The dynasty was gone. The tradition it had elevated and normalized persisted in the population for at least 2 more centuries under Roman administration, until Roman legal reform in the late 2nd century AD formally prohibited the practice throughout the empire. The Ptolemies had used an ancient theological legitimation to justify what the Greek world considered aberrant, and in doing so, they had made it ordinary. That is a particular kind of power, the power to normalize, to make strange things familiar through the sheer weight of institutional repetition. It is also, perhaps, the most durable thing the dynasty left behind, more durable than any of its buildings, more durable than any of its administrative innovations, more durable than the memory of the woman who was its last and most capable ruler. the site of Cleopatra's tomb, which she constructed herself, according to the ancient sources, and in which she was interred alongside Antony following their deaths, has not been conclusively identified. The ancient harbor of Alexandria, submerged following a sequence of seismic events in late antiquity, has been the subject of extensive underwater archaeological investigation since the 1980s, producing architectural fragments, sculpture, and navigational equipment that illuminate the physical world of the Ptolemaic court in considerable detail. The temple complex of Taposiris Magna, west of Alexandria along the Mediterranean coast, has been proposed in recent years as a candidate site for the tomb. Based on excavation findings that include coins bearing Cleopatra's image and a possible alabaster portrait head, the findings are suggestive. They are not conclusive. The tomb, if it survived the seismic and coastal erosion events that reshaped the Alexandrian coastline in late antiquity, and if it survives in a condition that makes identification possible, has not yet been found. She built it herself, according to the sources. She intended it to be her final act of permanence in a world that had been removing her permanence since the moment Octavian's legions crossed the Egyptian border. It may still be there, beneath the sand and the water, waiting. Or it may have been dissolved by 2,000 years of geological change into something unrecognizable. The record does not say. The record, on this point as on so many others, simply ends. What the record does say, across the surviving papyri, the coin series, the temple wall inscriptions, the administrative documents, the accounts of Greek and Roman and later Arab historians writing across a span of 7 centuries, is something that resists the simplifications that the biographical tradition has most consistently imposed on her. She was not primarily a lover. She was not primarily a victim. She was not a woman defined by the men whose alliance she sought and whose deaths she outlived for a time until she did not. She was an administrator. She was a strategist. She was a ruler who inherited a system of extraordinary brutality, a system in which marriage to a sibling was law, in which the removal of rival claimants was policy, in which the maintenance of dynastic authority required a willingness to make decisions that the sources record without flinching, and that history has generally preferred not to examine too directly. She operated within that system with a precision and a completeness and a coldness that distinguished her from every predecessor in the line. She held the power in those co-regencies. She held it in the marriages, in the governance, in the negotiations, in the theatrical displays that served as political communication, in the administrative decisions that kept Egypt functioning through years of external pressure that would have broken a less capable ruler. She held it, and the record of her holding it is written in tax documents and temple dedications, and the absence of any serious evidence that anyone else was governing when she was present to govern. And when she could no longer hold it, when the military situation became irretrievable and the last negotiations failed and the escape routes closed, she held the manner of its ending. That too was a decision. That too was governance of a kind. The authority had always been hers. Ginnisthoi. Let it be done. It was. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, histories where the official record tells one story and the silence between documents tells another, entirely consider subscribing. There are many more that have yet to be fully understood.